Hey guys, so today we're trying to take a step forward in at least planning ideas for your digital essay. Now that you've had a chance to think about what you might want to say, what kind of argument or arguments that might be, who your audience might be, you may even have some ideas for what kind of content you want to include. That's a little bit different than figuring out like how you want what order you want everything to be in, and how to start getting your sources in there. So today we're going to be going over some, I guess, building ideas, tips for organizing, a couple of refresher things, dealing with where and how you might address some other perspectives. So just some kind of planning and building, what to put in the background, what kind of sources to pick, what are some different organizing models you can use for some different types of arguments. So where we're going to start is just organizing, and at after each little section of some things we're going to go over, I'll have you in your notebook do some brainstorming just to kind of get some thoughts together, or some like his first thoughts about what you might be able to do, or what idea you might be able to come with in terms of planning based on what you just saw or what we just went over. And then that's what you'll submit. So while you're going through the presentation, just make some notes, do the brainstorming, and then that's what you'll submit when you finish. So we're going to start with organizing. So I want to refresh a couple of things from last week. First, don't forget the thesis myth, that the thesis statement can actually go in multiple places. It depends on what kind of argument you're making. And a lot of times it also depends on how controversial your issue is. If you are, again, doing something that's really talking about an issue that's really controversial, it's typically best to put it at the end, or you have a really passionate audience, a group that really opposes you. Then it's typically better to leave it for the end. Start with kind of a guiding question in place of where that thesis would go, because it puts them in a better position to be open and to hear what you have to say, and make it to the end of the essay. If it's not something that's super controversial, maybe you're just trying to raise awareness, it's probably okay to put that thesis statement right there in the beginning. And it gives your reader some focus, and that would be an appropriate time to do that. Sometimes you might put it in the middle if you're doing something like pro-con or problem solution, where you kind of have two big halves of the paper. So convincing people of maybe what the problem is, and then for the first part of the paper, and then the last part would be offering a solution for it. You might have a thesis statement at the beginning of that second half of the paper, and then reiterate it at the end. So there is some wiggle room there. Again, with the background information, we're going to talk about selecting sources for background and some tips for that, but reminders that you still, even with your background section, you can have more than one. Like you can have explaining what the current debate is, or the current conversation or situation is. You can have a section that explains some history, so you can have more than one purposeful background section, but the goal should be to have it be purposeful, not to throw out lots of information your reader already knows, and not to throw out random information that doesn't seem to fit together or have a point. So your reader doesn't really know why they need this information. So lots of history, especially like if you're getting in the Wayback Machine and doing lots of history of an issue from that long ago, a reader's not going to be able to pick up on what they're supposed to do with that. So everything should kind of have a point. So we're going to dive into a couple of ideas for how you can organize kind of the skeleton of everything. I'm going to start with a couple of things about your intro and conclusion. Again, kind of some, not necessarily myths, but some things that people sometimes pick up from that 5-paragraph essay. That's a good starting place, but it's not necessarily the rule for how everything should always go. So first, you're writing, you're working within a genre that is argumentative, and it's persuasive, and it's a little different from the annotated bibliography, because that was completely objective, no writerly presence, whereas with this essay you're writing to an audience, you are present, you want them to see how you're interpreting the information, you want it to be engaging, you want to ask questions, so it is a little bit of a different tone. And you may find that it's a little bit easier to write and a little bit more a little more entertaining for you to write than the annotated bibliography was, because it's engaging. Here are a couple things to think about. One, with the intro, don't start with bland information. Sometimes we have this habit of starting with like throughout time, or a dictionary definition, or in 1995, and use a bland date. Something that is a fact or a definition that isn't really super engaging. Rather than starting with a question or a quote or a current event or a surprising statistic or a hypothetical situation, something that's going to, what we call, hook your reader and make them want to read past the first sentence. You do have an investment and a responsibility as the writer to keep your reader wanting to read more with this style of writing. So you do want to be really careful. If you wouldn't want to read that first sentence, like most of us don't enjoy reading timelines or dictionaries and things like that. So if you wouldn't want to read it, your reader probably won't either. So just kind of keep that in mind and keep yourself in your reader's shoes in terms of thinking about whether or not you're being engaging or not. Same thing with the conclusion. Don't just reiterate what readers have already heard throughout the whole paper. It is okay to kind of wrap up and kind of restate main points in a different way, but you also want to leave them with sort of a hook. Oops. I have a typo right there. You want to leave them with, again, like a final question, a final suggestion, something to think about, ending with a quote, something that's thought-provoking, that's going to keep them or make them want to go do something else with this essay, or keep it with them. So sort of like planting a seed. It's not that different than what you did in the intro. The intro makes them want to read the rest of the paper. The conclusion makes it stick. So that they don't just forget it as soon as they walk away, so it stays with them. So we're going to be going over now and kind of diving into a few ideas for how you can organize the body of the essay. And I've got 6 ideas for different sort of models for how you can think about organizing the body. And what will be in that body are those required sections that you have to have. So remember, if you look at a scholarly article, and most articles that you read online, they are divided into sections, and those sections are sort of like mini essays, like each has a point. A scholarly article has a method section, a discussion section, a results section, and each of those has a point. You don't necessarily have to do your sections that way. You can provide titles for your sections. It can be based around a problem solution model or some kind of different ideas for how you want to organize it. But what you do need to think about is sort of practicing writing some of these longer texts by organizing the body, not just by paragraphs, but by sections, so that each part of the paper has a clear point. It moves in a certain order. And within each of those sections, there's several paragraphs and several sources really fleshing out that point. So we're going to go through some ideas for how you might be able to come up with some ideas for different sections. So the first idea is a topical pattern. This is the most common. If you are thinking about doing any sort of raising awareness or clearing up misconceptions, topical pattern is great. It really is just sort of a point by point or possibly getting people to like believe or support a certain idea, change people's minds about something. If you want to argue that this is in fact true or that this is in fact a big deal, you probably have 3 or 4 reasons why this is a big deal. And the body of your paper, your sections, each revolves around really fleshing out one of those reasons. I have an idea here for what I call a refutation. This is sort of where we're thinking about addressing other perspectives. The entire paper is about sort of addressing those misconceptions. It's one of the types of arguments that we talked about also. If you really just want to clear up what you believe to be wrong thinking or stereotypes, So a lot of times people will use this to clear up if people are afraid of something. So each section will be around a concern that the audience has about an idea, and with each section you'll explain the concern or the stereotype or the myth, and then you'll spend the rest of that explaining where it comes from, and then you'll spend the rest of that section explaining or kind of clearing it up. So here's what people are afraid of. Here's why, where that fear sort of comes from. Here are the reasons why people don't need to be afraid of this. Or here's what people often believe to be true. Here's where this thinking comes from. Here's where it might be valid. And spend the rest of the time sort of correcting that idea. So that's sort of where each section is sort of built around that. Okay. So the next couple. Next three, number 3 and 4. First one is a problem solution pattern. Again, you would begin with either a current problem that you want to solve. Maybe you have an idea for a solution, or there are a couple of solutions that you want to think about and maybe argue why one is better than the other. You would have to start by probably convincing people in a first section what the problem is, why it needs to be addressed. Or explaining why people believe certain solutions will work. Again, that kind of takes me into the next one. Problematic solutions that are problematic solutions or practices that are currently being used. So maybe you want to address a current policy that we have and point out what's problematic about it. And then or the last part of your paper would be sections that kind of break down your solution and why it would better meet needs, or a policy that would replace the one in the problematic one, or even corrections. So again, you're starting with, you want to always kind of end with, I guess, whatever your point is. So with this one, you're either beginning with explaining the problem you're going to solve, you're explaining the problematic policy first that you're going to try to change, however you're going to come at this. Cause and effect, or showing the correlation. This was another one of the kinds of arguments. It can be organized by going through either causes and then all of the effects, or vice versa. It depends on how you're going to come at this. For example, if you're writing an argument about trying to argue that fast food is really the root cause of obesity, you're going to have to start by talking about obesity. You might even have to start then by explaining what other people wrongly believe are the causes of obesity, and then explain why it's really connected to fast food. Those are 3 different sections. Another example, attention problems are caused by the rise in our use of technology. You'd have to start by talking about attention problems. Talk about why that really is so prevalent, talk about the presence of that and the rise of attention problems in our society, talk about some reasons people think that that's happening, and then possibly then get into linking it to technology. So there's just some ideas of how you might go about that order. If you're trying to argue an effect, you start with the problem, all the causes for it, and then you argue what the effects are. If you're trying to argue causes, so like the cause for domestic violence, you would start with domestic violence. You would start with all of the causes people think are there, and then you would argue yours. I know this is a whole lot to take in at one time. You're going to have a second to kind of think in a minute. Advantages and disadvantages. Again, it's similar to doing like a pro-con. It's not that dissimilar from the other models. Again, it's always better to end with the point you want to make, and the argument that you want to make can be complicated. It doesn't have to be that you see like all of the disadvantages and you don't see any advantages. It could be that you see both, like there's advantages to this, there are disadvantages, but you kind of want to argue that like one outweighs the other. So the example that I offered is if you want to convince others of disadvantages, start with advantages and then explain where you see the disadvantages and explain why they're more impactful. So if you're arguing that while there are many clear advantages to children using technology, which there are, you may want to argue that the bad outweighs the good. You could start by explaining the positives in the first part of the paper. So here's how children are using technology. Here's why it's rising. Create a picture of what the situation is, and then get into all the good things about technology in a second part of the paper. And then in the third part, get into what the negatives are, and either in that section or even in a brand new one, explain why they are more impactful. Do that comparing. The last idea is a Rogerian model. If you have something controversial, this is a very nice argumentative model to use. It's based on the communication principles of Carl Rogers, and it's a psychologist, and it's more along the lines of conflict resolution. It's intended to kind of reach a compromise. And I find this to be a really effective model. Not necessarily just for you can use this also for kind of problem solutions. You can use this for a lot of different kinds of arguments, but it really works where it's something controversial and where both sides really disagree on something, so like political arguments, things like that. In this model, writers cover the other perspective first. So once you get into the body of the paper, you are really trying to flesh out and show the other side how you understand where they're coming from and what their concerns are. Then you get into presenting your own argument in a second part of the paper, and then you end with a solution that kind of is intended to reach a compromise. So it does mean kind of explaining like where you have some common ground, what you can agree on, and maybe even having to give up something on your part in order to kind of meet them halfway. And then in this case, your thesis statement would be toward the end. So I do want you to just take a few minutes in your notebook. If you have any ideas for intro ideas for how you might want to start, ideas for a hook, you can write that down. I didn't include it here, but it is something to think about. The main thing I want you to take a few minutes and write about, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, is kind of thinking about some of the models we just went through and which might work best, maybe looking back at what you said you wanted your argument to be, what kind of argument you said that was, and even maybe flipping back through the presentation a little bit, just to see which one kind of would work best. Little typo, I'm going to fix that right now. Maybe thinking about if you have any ideas right now for sections that you want to create. Maybe you already know that you're going to need to explain like really a current problem, or you know you're going to have to really flesh out like a current policy that's in place that you want to talk about, or maybe you're going to have like different sections for a couple of different solutions that you're going to have to talk about. So maybe some ideas for that, and then any new ideas or a new idea, or maybe a change or anything for where you think your thesis statement might go based on the model that you might use. So take a few minutes and then we'll kind of move on once you come back.